delighted to see so many people. Gutted nobody went for the big armchairs though, so feel free if you feel like you want to have a relaxing time. Anyway, just to welcome you all today, I'm Helen Mile. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Vue. So it's my team that does this research every year, and it's something that we do because we really want to help the industry understand what the future of programmatic looks like. So what are the challenges? What are the concerns that people need to be addressing, and what do we need to work together? But also, how fast is it growing? And this year we're seeing increasing number of brands, increasing revenue year on year, brands returning, both small and large. So, really positive picture for programmatic out of home. And for the research this year, we spoke to 1,200 media executives from the buy side across 6 different markets. That was the UK, US, Australia, Spain, France, and Germany, to get an accurate barometer of the state of programmatic out of home. One of the most interesting facts that stood out for me from the UK was that there is still a lot of incremental budget coming into programmatic digital out of home. Incredibly, 33% of UK advertisers surveyed stated that they were reallocating budgets from other digital channels. 24% were reallocating budget from traditional channels, and 15% were creating net new budgets specifically for programmatic digital out of home. A really positive picture, I'm sure you'll agree with me. But in order to access these new budgets, these net new budgets, what the research also showed is that buying does need to be diversified. So whilst only 4% of main out-of-home teams are able to access those new budgets, this increases to 25% when you have a dedicated programmatic digital out-of-home buying team, and to 28% when you go through the main digital programmatic teams. But in the UK, actually, it's the managed service DSPs who are really tapping into that at 50%. I'm sure the panel will have something to say about this. So please do, ask questions. We have a Slido, which will come up on stage. There's also an opportunity, and we'll do a Q&A session. But I'm going to hand over to Gavin Wilson, who's our Global Chief Revenue and Customer Officer. And thank you again to all the panelists for coming here today.
Thank you, Helen. Great to see so many people, many that we know. Great to see some new faces as well. Thank you for joining today and coming to Vue's State of the Nation UK. As Helen said, I'm Gavin. I'll be chairing today. I've got a great panel here, and hopefully we can tap into some of the questions and feedback from this year's report. Just quickly, fire exits, the door that you came in and one on the side there. No planned fire alarms, but obviously if you do hear a fire alarm, please just exit the building. Helen mentioned there's a Slido on screen. It's also in the little leaflet that you've got. The leaflet just highlights the top 5 findings from this year's report. Please do take it away, share it with your team. Obviously, share it as you wish, but do please ask questions, as Helen mentioned, either on Slido or at the end. We'll have a mic just going around the room so you can ask any of the panel or myself anything you'd like. Maybe the panel, you could introduce yourself, probably rather than me doing it. Thanks for joining us today. Helen, maybe we can start with you, please.
So I'm Helen Bull, Helen number 2, and I'm out-of-home trading director at Dentsu. I've been working in out-of-home for the last 23 years, and so it's a very, very exciting time looking at how programmatic is changing the out-of-home landscape and driving growth, we hope, so that hopefully we can get past the 5% share of media spend.
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen. And Alvaro, perhaps next, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alvaro. I'm a programmatic manager for HP. And I've been in programmatic for the last 8 years, which is basically my whole career so far. And digital out of home has always been a channel that we've been chasing, from the beginning. And it's very exciting to see how it's now a mainstay opportunity. So, yeah.
A particular thanks to you, because you're actually on holiday today,
I'm
aren't you?
technically supposed to be on holiday. It's a little parenthesis of my holidays.
From Budapest, I think, today, from the holiday. So
I am.
Really appreciate that. So I hope it's worthwhile for you as well.
You.
So, and Chanel, good to see you.
Perfect. I'm Chanel, Commercial and Partnerships Director of Hawk UK and International. I've been at Hawk now for 8 years, pretty much since we launched into the UK market. If you're unfamiliar with Hawk as a business, we are a cookieless omni-channel platform. We help brands to unify their approach to planning, activation and measurement across mobile, audio, digital out-of-home, CTV and in-game. My role entails working closely with all of our partners to drive the ecosystem forward and identify new opportunities for collaboration through innovation.
Thank you, and thanks again for coming today. Helen mentioned one of the really interesting statistics, and I'd like to start there, and it's the amount of revenue or campaign budget that's shifting from other channels. Last year, the report showed us about 21% of budget was coming into the channel was from other channels. This year, that figure is 33%, so quite a significant shift. Obviously, that bodes well for this channel. Helen, maybe an agency perspective would be a good place to start. Is that what you're seeing? Is that indicative of how Dentsu kind of see the money moving around? Maybe what does that sort of suggest for the industry and growth as well, please, in your opinion?
So what's interesting is 33% is exactly the same number, and that's what we've seen global brands activating as a percentage in programmatic this year. But we're not seeing it being shifted from other digital channels. We're seeing it as new money into programmatic digital out of home, which is really, really positive. I think that's growing for a number of factors. I think, obviously more and more screens are now becoming available programmatically, so that opens up new opportunities. But also I think that the improved and continually enhanced planning and measurement opportunities through the DSP side is presenting a real opportunity for brands because they can plan out of home alongside their other digital channels, and they can measure the impact of moving budget between the different channels. So I think that that's what's driving growth.
Great. And I guess that net new money is really important, isn't it, from where you're sat? Obviously, people in the room might be thinking we don't mind where the money comes from if it's coming from other channels, but I suppose net new money is an indicator that advertising is buoyant as a whole, and obviously brands are investing across the board. So Alvaro, maybe the same question to you. Are you seeing that kind of movement as a brand in terms of where you allocate spend, or are you finding net new money as your CEO releasing extra funds for branding and marketing, or is it moving money around from A to B?
Well, it's very interesting because in HP we're the in-house activation team. So we're also a global hub based in Barcelona. So we have the view of the entire EMEA market, and that's kind of what we're seeing. It depends a bit on the country and the opportunity. Since we started back in September with digital out of home, we haven't stopped. We activated in Europe, in Africa, all over, and we're seeing depending on the opportunity. For example, the first one we did back in Germany, that came with incremental budget as well because they like so much the idea. Some of them are also taking money depending on the strategy from other maybe retail budgets, etc. So it kind of depends from time to time, but we are seeing the graph go up in digital out of home. It's now a mainstay channel basically in our media plans.
Yeah, and I think a lot of businesses are doing that. They're trialing, where that money comes from. It almost doesn't matter. They're trialing, they're usually having a positive experience, and then obviously it's how can they invest more subject to the KPIs, which we'll talk a bit about later. Shanil, I guess from a DSP perspective, there was a further statistic that said that 15% of respondents were adding new budget to programmatic out of home, and that DSP teams were responsible for adding half of that 15%, which I'm sure is a stat you like. Yep. Does that line up with the Hawk experience? And do you know, or can you kind of attribute what's driving that?
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely lines up with what we're seeing. I guess for us, it's all incremental new budget that we're seeing because, in 2019, we were a mobile-only business and we've transitioned massively in that 4 years. So in that 4-year period, everything that we're now doing on out-of-home is incremental. So it's really interesting to hear Helen's kind of holistic view on that, the fact that it is net new budgets that are being added rather than being shifted from other channels. But yeah, absolutely, that's definitely what we're seeing. I mean, if we look at the share of digital out of home and programmatic out of home that's now going through our platform, it's pretty much about 33%, so about a third of what we see now coming through our platform is coming from programmatic out of home, and that's obviously being driven by the great work that we're doing with all of our agencies and partners in the room here today. What do we attribute that to? I think there's two different elements to that. There's the structural element and there's probably the evolutionary element. From a structural standpoint, there's more people now working in out of home. So there's more new buyers that are buying out of home. Agency trading desks are now buying out of home, whereas 4 or 5 years ago they probably weren't. Pure play programmatic players are now buying it as well. So formerly kind of performance trading desks are now also buying out of home as well. And we'll come on to why that is very, very shortly. New players entering into the space, so us, Bliss, Quantcast, all of the DSPs and media platforms that are entering into the space as well as partners like Captify, partners like Samba, who are decoupling their data and also entering in this space as well. And I think that's really, really positive for the whole industry and the whole out-of-home space. The second side of that, I guess, is kind of twinned to what I just talked about there, the fact that the industry is moving forward. We're seeing more data opportunities, more measurement opportunities, more dynamic creative opportunities. So all of that increases confidence in out-of-home and kind of puts out-of-home in a different space to maybe where it was 4 or 5 years ago. So those two things colliding at the same time helps to lift out-of-home and helps to bring those budgets into the space, I think.
Great, thank you very much. So we've talked a bit there about net new money, and we've talked a little bit about kind of just the general swell in the ecosystem. A really interesting stat was 38% of UK buyers used a combination of programmatic alongside direct. So if we kind of laser focus on just the channel itself, which I think is what media owners want to hear, want to know, the direct proposition is not going away. It's how do you potentially utilise the two alongside each other. So maybe if we can stay with you, Shanil, is that a trend that as a DSP, you see positively? Obviously, you're interested in the programmatic side, but I guess maybe a better question is the programmatic element. What's the value you see that brings alongside the direct element? Please?
Yeah. And I think to quote Dom, who said this quite a few times, traditional out-of-home isn't broken. So it's not the fact that programmatic is, way better than traditional out-of-home. But there are reasons why it does add value. And I think that the reasons for that are data. So, more and more data coming into the space and that being able to be activated in real time, which I think is really, really important, especially if you look at the way that the world is changing with AI and the way that other channels are changing. It just helps to keep programmatic out of home on par with kind of what those other channels are talking about, which I think is really important when we step into an omni-channel world. Measurement is obviously key, and I think that we're doing some really good things in this space, and other people are in the room as well. But we'll come on to what that is very shortly. But I think measurement is another reason as to why maybe you should consider programmatic out of home as an option. The omni-channel piece, being able to tie it together with other channels, being able to look at retargeting off the back of out of home, how it ties together with audio, how it ties together with mobile, how it ties together with CTV. I think that's really, really key. Creative, the fact that you can, now execute very dynamic creative strategies off the back of being able to execute campaigns programmatically. And also from a kind of agility standpoint, being able to activate very, very quickly, be very, very reactive to certain trends. I think that's really, really key as well. So there's a few reasons there, and that's not to say that everything should be bought programmatically, but if you're planning a campaign and one of those things is important to you, then programmatic should absolutely be part of that conversation, because that's, for me, the value that programmatic brings.
Yeah, it's a great list, thank you. Alvaro, what's a brand's perspective here? Direct alongside programmatic, a little bit of both? Does it depend on the campaign and the objectives? What's your stance, please?
Yes, so I was just telling Helen, this question is a bit personal to me, because I've been in programmatic most of my career, so I've had to fight against direct buying most of the time. And most of the time, I would say I recommend programmatic first in almost every channel, except out of home, because I think there are some touch points and there are some things that just pop and they are very creative and inventive that you can do in out of home that you still cannot do in programmatic out of home. Well, in HP, we're kind of proud that the programmatic team is like the first point of contact for out-of-home opportunities. Like, we try to exhaust what we can do in programmatic out-of-home before we move to direct, unless it's something more high impact. I do think that they're both complement each other, because you have different elements for different types of strategies, and also like some stuff like, for example, when you do this bus stops and you turn them around to feed a brand. Those things, unfortunately, you cannot do yet on programmatic because it involves more hand labor and stuff. So I think they're both complement each other, especially in this channel. Other channels, I don't ask me about it. So yeah.
Well, I think 95% of display is now bought programmatically,
Yes.
but it's 10 years further down the line. So it doesn't mean this channel will necessarily go that way.
Exactly.
And right now, I completely agree. I think both offer value in different ways, subject to the goals and aims of each campaign strategy. So I couldn't
I
agree
still
more.
remember the time where we had to convince people not to do IO buying for display because it was like, we have it here, you know. But,
Yeah. Helen, from an agency perspective, I guess a lot of what your team's role is still perhaps educate first-time customers being the brand. Do you find that they are clear on direct alongside programmatic? Do they tend to sway one way or the other? What's the agency kind of thought on that? Do you just almost let it be whatever their aims are, or do you guide? I'm just curious, sort of for those first foray into the channel, what does it look like usually?
Well, we see it very much as our role to help educate in that space, and some advertisers really get it, and some advertisers don't. And so, quite recently, we got asked the question: what percentage of my digital out-of-home money should I spend on programmatic versus direct? And the answer is, well, it depends on the brief. And so everything that Chanel outlined in terms of why would you activate programmatically, we've got to do that education piece with them. So there's no, one size fits all. But we do get that question quite a lot, and it's kind of a brand new thing, programmatic, digital out of home. How much should I spend in it? But it really depends on the campaign objectives and what you want to deliver.
Yep. Thank you. Sustainability, rightly so, a really, really important topic in life at the moment, not just this industry. This industry obviously having quite a bit of press on the topic at the moment. I'm really curious as businesses what your companies are doing to address this, obviously within the realms of what you can share, please. Maybe Alvaro first. What is it that your business is doing? And where, I guess, does the programmatic element fit into that? Are we doing enough? Would love your opinion just on that topic, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think overall we could be doing more as an industry in terms, not only programmatic, but as the ad industry to be more sustainable. It's kind of interesting because HP's core business is, we want to be one of the most sustainable tech companies in the world, and it's one of our core pillars. So then with in-housing media, it was like our responsibility now to offset and make our media practices more sustainable. So we've started having now a task force within the in-house agency for sustainable media practice, start finding partners and start working not only on out-of-home or on programmatic, but also in all the channels to make sure that we are on standards with the whole company's sustainability vision and mission. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I think brands have an absolute obligation in this, don't they?
Yes,
to
we
drive
definitely
the way.
do. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, really important that everybody in the ecosystem is championing this. So,
Yeah,
Chanel, similar question.
Yeah, as Alvaro said, we're not doing enough as an industry. I think we can always do more, but we are certainly, on that journey. I think we're moving forward every year, and that's all we can really ask for from all of our businesses is that we do take those steps forward. It's not going to be a quick process. From our perspective, we launched our sustainability initiative at the beginning of this year, which is called Carbon Cut. So Carbon Cut seeks to look at sustainability and carbon emissions in two different ways. The first way being creative delivery, and I think that's where, as a business, and as a platform especially, we're kind of uniquely positioned in this aspect because we have such a brilliant creative studio that helps brands to build creatives across all of the different channels that we offer. So instead of just inheriting assets and running them out across any channel that we are asked to run them on, our creative studio can look to compress the file weight, look at the cleanest way to deliver that creative and reduce the file load size. And I think that's really important. Also doing things like turning down the brightness of ads, for example. So we found that by reducing the brightness of an ad by 20%, you cut the emissions by 80%. So I think that's a really nice kind of offset for brands who are willing to make that sacrifice. And we're doing some A/B testing internally at the moment as the effect that has on performance. And once we prove that it doesn't really have a negative effect on performance, hopefully more advertisers will adopt it. So that's one element of Carbon Cut, the creative side of things. And then the supply chain is obviously the second part of it. And I think where we work across various different channels and many different channels, it's a really, really complex space for us to approach because the supply chain on display and video is very different to the supply chain on digital out of home and audio that are traded on, much shorter supply paths with less, technologies in the middle emitting carbon emissions. So yeah, we're looking at supply chain, cleanest route to supply, but creative delivery as well. I think that when it comes to sustainability, it's important to note that I think that out of home is doing a pretty good job. There's always more that we could do, like I said, and reading the View reports, the State of the Nation report, I didn't know there was kind of mandatory blackouts in Germany, for example, overnight, which I think is a really nice initiative and something that would cut down on carbon emissions and that maybe that we can look to adopt. In France, it's becoming harder and harder to advertise carbon emitting products. And there has to be disclaimers on certain products if you are going to emit that. So that's another thing that we could look to learn from. But looking at the PwC report that came out a couple of months ago, 46% of all investment into out of home goes back into sustainable and kind of initiatives within the community. So sometimes we have carbon tunnel vision. There's a lot around sustainability outside of carbon, and I think it's important to know that out of home is doing a pretty good job. All channels are trying to do their thing, but there's always more that we could be doing as well.
I think that 20-80% stat is
Yeah.
fantastic, and as you said, if you can determine that the impact or the performance impact is not effective, that is
Yeah, I think that's the challenge really, isn't it? And we have to all be realistic in that we live in a world where we're still tasked on outcomes. Like all of our businesses are tasked on outcomes. So number one is making sure that, yes, we are doing the right thing from a sustainability standpoint, but proving the fact to stakeholders that are making these sorts of decisions that actually it's not going to have that negative impact. You need to do both of those two things together, otherwise it's just going to get shot down straight away.
My opinion is it's a collective of
Yeah.
triggers that will help.
Yeah, exactly.
Be it the blackout at times, be it the kind of reducing the brightness. It'll be lots of different triggers that will essentially.
Yeah, and sorry, just to quickly add to that, the fact that like the major 6 holdcos have all built carbon calculators in the past, 3 years, is testament to how quickly we are moving in this space. So the fact that we are starting to get to a point where we can measure it, we can plan around it, and that agencies are, I imagine, ultimately going to start making decisions as to which partners they use based on performance and carbon emissions, I think is a good space for us to be at the moment.
Helen, do you want to add to that? Maybe?
Yeah, so Dentsu is very busy in that space. We've got our own carbon calculator, as you mentioned. We're looking at how we integrate digital out of home into that. And that's going to impact, our supply chain as well and who we choose as partners moving forward. But I think going back to your previous point as well about data and measurement, increasingly brands are starting to use carbon emissions as a metric when they're planning digital out-of-home campaigns. So it's really interesting to see how some SSP and DSP platforms are using this as a planning metric and a measurement metric. And I think increasingly we're seeing that brands are using that as a key planning a metric or KPI when they're speaking to us. But yeah, I think we all do need to collectively do more. And I think it's right to call out that out of home is actually already doing quite a lot in terms of sustainability. So we're in a good channel.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think to echo Helen's comments, I think what we try to do as well in HP, like as a big brand, I think big brands have a big responsibility to also push the industry towards these sustainability standards, because sometimes, while out of home overall has a very good sustainability footprint, I think it's always the best to make sure that you use your own negotiating power as well as a brand to make sure that the industry follows the standards you want.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. The UK report this year said that advertisers indicated that programmatic outdoor was important for performance-led campaigns at 81%, over brand-led campaigns at 71%. It's an interesting statistic. It's actually quite similar in most markets, the 6 markets Helen mentioned. It may come as a little bit of a surprise because obviously the channel's strength has typically been a brand-led channel, albeit I think to the points mentioned earlier, everything has to be tangible, measurable, etc., and that's probably the natural evolution for the channel. Helen, maybe from an agency perspective, is that indicative of what you're seeing? And do you have any examples, perhaps you'd be happy to share, where both metrics have been important to a brand, or maybe one metric's been overly important versus the other?
So I think and I hate to talk about COVID, but I think, we're still in a kind of a post-COVID economic squeeze era. And I think that what we've seen is that has really driven advertisers to focus on performance. So there's been a real shift and trying to use digital out of home to drive performance, which it certainly can do if it's got the right metric and we're doing the right measurement. But actually out of home is about brand building, and programmatic digital out of home should be added onto that to complement it, to drive through the funnel. So I don't have any specific examples that I can share, but I know that at Dentsu we're doing quite a lot of work with our brands to try and reset this balance and help them to understand how driving brand awareness is obviously going to then filter down through the funnel and help to drive performance. So out of home can work in both of those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I think it's all about the customer and where they are in that funnel, and then what, again, is the tactics to utilise or to engage with that customer. Shalil, from a DSP perspective, is it binary? Is it brand or performance? Is it both? What's the kind of general census with your
I'd say
part?
it's rarely binary anymore. I'd say that there's very rarely a brief that we get now that says, this is a brand campaign, we don't want to see any metrics off the back of it, right? So in that sense, everything is going to be related back to some form of performance. As Helen mentioned, we're living in tough economic times at the moment. Advertisers aren't going to just invest and not want to see, the return on that investment. So the whole nature of brand versus performance is kind of being eroded, I would argue. The whole kind of purchase funnel is almost being challenged as a result of various different things. So I don't think it's binary at all. I think from our perspective, given the fact that we have that omni-channel capability, the ability to serve brand campaigns, but then also retarget with other channels to then drive users further and further down that funnel that I just said was being challenged, but I'll use it anyway. But drive users down that purchase funnel and look at retargeting and really put audiences at the core of strategies rather than channels at the core of strategies. That's been one of the biggest changes that I think that we've seen as a business in the past 3 years. The fact that agencies, brands are now coming to us and saying, this is my audience. How are you going to use the multiple touch points to be able to reach this audience? And I think that that's what's become really, really smart and really, really clever. Good example, we work really closely with Stellantis. We've actually just been nominated for an award with you guys for that campaign. And it was a brand campaign that wanted to drive people into dealerships. The core KPI was tracking footfall. But what we found off the back of dealership analysis was that the dealerships that we were driving into, they sold 50% of their annual sales target within 3 months while the campaign was live. So even though we didn't know it was being measured, was being measured in the background, and that was being related back to performance. So even if you're running some sort of a brand campaign, it will always be linked back to performance. And I think that it's good. We now have the measurement to be able to do it, and I think that that's a good space to be. What I would say is let's learn lessons of what we've maybe done with other channels, so analysis paralysis on kind of display and video, where you can measure everything and then you end up measuring nothing at the same time, or one metric falls down and suddenly it's not a success. And also let's account for the nuances between all the different channels as well. Out-of-home measurement isn't going to be the same as display measurement, isn't going to be the same as audio measurement, but as long as you know what those channels are doing and try and understand what those channels are doing together, then I think that we'll be in a pretty good space.
Yeah, absolutely. Alvaro, any thoughts on the performance versus branding kind of topic?
Yes, I mean, going back to the fact that we have a regional hub, it depends kind of on the market. Like some people, we were talking about this a few minutes ago, like what is exactly performance? You can have brand metrics as well as performance. Like you need to pick your KPI, and depending on, some people want to see more numbers, some people want to see the brand equity go up. Because us as a big brand, the brand equity is as important as like a CPA or whatever. So we do need to just make sure that we are measuring something. It doesn't have to be what we think of digital metrics, but we do need to find the way to relate out of home to some sort of success. Like we have, for example, this campaign that we work with you guys in Germany that we've been talking about, that also got nominated for award recently. That there we had a KPI. We had a KPI to see if we could influence search conversion rate as much as with like offline channels. So that was like our goal. And then when we achieved it, that's when we knew that the channel was working. And for other channels, I just want to see like if the sales go up or the sales go down, or if the brand guidelines panels are improving. So it just depends on what you want and what you need in that moment for your business. Because also, since we are in-housing, at least from my point of view, the benefit of in-housing is that it opens up like a lot of business metrics as well. So you have like a plethora of stuff that you can look at, not only at media, but also deep in the business to see what it's improving through out of home. So that's interesting.
Great, thank you. Quick reminder, everyone, we've got the code on screen. If you want to ask questions of the panel at the end, please do keep adding to it. As I said, the code is also on the leaflet on your chairs. We'd love to get some questions from the room for the end of the session. We've started to talk about measurement there, which I think is really important. The industry is evolving. There are obviously areas that we have to develop and evolve, and measurement is obviously critical. If we can't measure and prove out the value of what we're all trying to do, then obviously it falls quite quickly by the wayside. So Shanil, maybe to you first. What is the right measurement? And is that too big a question? Should we be looking at other channels' measurement tactics? Are those channels fundamentally so different that actually the same measurement tactics and metrics can't be utilised? Like, what's the sort of DSP stance looking at all of those channels together? And how should we almost judge ourselves as an industry and channel?
Yeah, it's a complex answer to that question. Because there's so many different nuances between all of the different channels. So it's really difficult, or it has been previously very difficult to be able to look at all of those through one single lens. I think that we're doing some really good work in this space. So I'll come on to what that is very, very shortly. But yeah, from an attribution standpoint, there's no set, like this is the way that you measure out of home, or this is the way that you measure out of home when it's twinned with audio, or when it's twinned with mobile, when it's twinned with CTV. It's very much brief by brief. And I think that from our standpoint, we have a brilliant like omni-channel cookieless measurement suite that we can tap into that looks at things like footfall. It looks like things like search uplift with the great work that we're doing with Captify. It can look at incremental reach from certain channels versus your linear TV campaign from what we're doing with Samba TV. It can look at brand lift. It can look at a variety of different things. So when we receive a brief, the main thing that we do is interrogate the outcome. What does the brand want to achieve from this, and how are we going to measure it? And I think picking one thing is really, really important, because like I said before, otherwise you end up trying to measure everything and you end up measuring nothing at the same time. So I think from an attribution standpoint, that's really, really key. And then from a channel perspective, like how you look at that through one single lens, it's about finding the common denominators between all of those channels, because out of home inherently is completely different to the way that mobile display is consumed. It's one-to-one versus one-to-many. So a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment, if we're looking at out of home, is from brand studies, we can isolate users that have been kind of exposed to out of home and then retargeted. So we did some brilliant work with Gusto on that, which we won an award for in 2020. But more recently, it's about looking at what's going on within specific geos and locations, and looking at search trends within those locations. So a good example of that is the Reebok campaign that we ran earlier this year. We managed to take Reebok's share of search from an out-of-home campaign from 3% to 20% in exposed geos. So instead of looking at a specific individual, because that's becoming more and more difficult to do anyway with the privacy changes that are coming into effect across all channels, it's about looking at what's going on within those geos that you're serving advertising into, and then comparing it to control geos. And I think that's some of the work that we're doing at the moment.
I was going to come to you later on this question, but it seems quite relevant to do it now. So 7 out of 10 respondents to the UK State of the Nation research felt that integration into that omnichannel logic is absolutely critical now. Does that create attribution questions? Or again, it is of course a measurement-based topic, and what do you attribute to what and how? But is that a complexity we just haven't even started looking at, or should we not be worrying about that now? Or how do you tackle that? Because you started to touch on it.
Yeah, it does. It does throw out some complexities. Our research team are in the room, and they'll definitely agree that it throws out some complexities. We have started looking at it, and like I said, it is possible to isolate devices that have been exposed to out of home that have then been retargeted with other media. The Gusto example was a really good one. And that was back in 2020. So if you think about that's 3 years ago in ad tech, that's basically a lifetime. So there's a lot more that we can do now. So we have started that process. Like I said, though, it's not going to be possible, and I don't think with the privacy change, it's not going to be possible to look at all channels with the same attribution. There are going to be nuances, and that's where tying it back to space, tying it back to geo, then becomes a nice way for brands to do that, especially given that that's the way a lot of brands are starting to activate anyway, because they are looking at all those channels, and the easiest way to do that is by looking at where those users are at any one time.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Alvaro, back to the question before then about kind of measurement metrics. You touched a little bit about it in your previous answer, but anything specific you expect the channel to measure or hold itself to account against? Or again, is it the omnichannel logic and setting out those clear kind of objectives and KPIs from the kind of beginning?
Yes, so since, for example, I've personally worked in a couple first-time digital out-of-home campaigns in some markets, and like what Helen was saying about education is very important, because sometimes people think, oh, out-of-home deep is programmatic, so it's like a sci-fi movie, I'm going to be able to measure everything, who saw it, frequency, and it takes a lot of like managing expectations and making sure like, hey, this is more of a maybe awareness channel, or you can look at it within the full funnel, but the measurement standards shouldn't be held accountable to other channels, especially because what they were saying is one-to-many, it's not one-to-one. And also, even some of the measurement opportunities we have now, like they're based on mobile or something, it's not necessarily that we have, sometimes one of the troubles we see is like, oh, you have a great CPA because we measured the people that saw your ad and then went to your website, whatever. But the universe of those devices that are being measured sometimes may not be statistically significant to the overall population that actually saw your ad. So that metric, you can be looking at metrics because you want to see metrics because that's what you're used to, but that metric might not be what is really happening. So it's really about, making sure that the whole funnel of channels is delivering on their specific API. Like, for example, in the campaigns that we've run with you guys, we always make sure to have a brand lift study in place to make sure that something is being improved in terms of those metrics. And one more thing that I would like to say is like something that we talked about the other day is that we're so obsessed sometimes with measurement that we lose sight of the fact that we're all users, and the privacy concerns that we need to take place to have like very, very accurate measurement of this type of channel, like digital channels, we need to be addressed because, for example, in HP, we're also very important. We're also taking into account more being ethical in the way that we target and the way that data is compiled. So I think, what would need to happen for us to measure out of home that way, So I think that's also something that we need to not lose sight of.
Agreed. The ethical part, remembering there's a customer behind adverts at the end of the day. How do you talk to them? In what way? With what respect? What frequency? We have to remember that because you can alienate the end consumer against advertising in theory. So
exactly. Something that I found very interesting that I hadn't thought about when reading the State of the Union was that, out of home is actually more of a private channel than some of the other channels. And sometimes users just get a bit freaked out when they see a very, very targeted ad, And out of home, I think, is walking that line of like being targeted, being used smartly, but not in a way that people will be like, oh, how much they know about me, So I think that's important to keep it that way.
Yeah, very good point. Helen, obviously, agencies' kind of core elements is measurement and ultimately, making sure the right KPIs are set and demonstrating value. Anything else to add on what Chanel and Alvaro have said in terms of KPIs, the right sort of measurement elements in the channel?
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on something that Alvaro said, which I wasn't going to talk about, but I'm just picking up on. So I've just come back from 9 years in the Middle East, and digital out of home is relatively nascent there. And everyone's kind of testing it and no one really understands it. Programmatic in terms of digital out of home doesn't really exist. But for example, facial recognition technology was kind of a big thing out there where you could serve ads on a digital screen depending on who's standing in front of them. But of course, you sort of forget about cultural differences. And in the Middle East, for example, people don't want to be recognised. So that would really be a negative experience. But sorry, going back to your question, in terms of what we're seeing, so for example, still we're being asked how many click-throughs is my programmatic digital out-of-home campaign going to generate? So there's really this no, and it's, but you know, and you laugh, but it's true. So there still is this massive education piece to do. I think in terms of measurement, there's a real opportunity here. So out-of-home, for the 23 years that I've been in it, we've never been able to crack a standardised measurement piece globally ever. So I do think that programmatic digital out-of-home potentially has the opportunity to solve a problem for programmatic digital out-of-home in any case. And certainly what we're seeing in Dentsu is that a barrier sometimes to growing programmatic digital out-of-home is that we don't have that standardised measurement or currency that allows advertisers to really easily understand the impact of shifting budget between different digital channels, including digital out-of-home. So if we can crack that, I think it will drive growth. We're not quite there yet, but there must be a solution.
I think it's a brilliant point. I mean, I always reference we've got to ensure that the channel is not an outlier. If you're planning holistically, yes, what is the DNA across all channels that is non-negotiable? And things like that, the measurement, the KPI, the absolute narrative around that has to be, because if you're planning and buying and you can't understand that across all channels, then you have an outlier, you have a problem. I think this channel's professionalised so much in that sense in the last few years, but I agree there's definitely more to do. One of the top 5 needs to drive investment in the UK from the report was around always-on deals. Obviously much more prevalent, becoming a bit more mainstream in my opinion. Certainly a lot of DSPs offering that now, media owners obviously utilising some of their inventory in that way. Shanil, maybe to you first. What's your take on this? Is it the right direction of travel? Is there much more we can do? Is it making things just easier? Again, maybe to my outlier comment, is this just a barrier that's now removed, which is great? What's your perspective on sort of AO deals?
Certainly a nice to have. I think that if we're talking about the benefit, one of the benefits of programmatic out of home being the agility and the ability to turn on and off campaigns really quickly, then always on deals always help with that because it reduces the need for kind of correspondence between various parties. In the DSP, you can pretty much overlay whatever you want to in terms of targeting. So you've kind of got your toolkit there, you've got your inventory there, you've got your data sitting in the same place, you've got your measurement suite. So ultimately, if everything sits in one place and you can activate it across all screens and cherry pick screens that you want to, then that's great. It's definitely a nice to have for sure.
Yeah, Helen, to you maybe. Is it an expectation now with your partners and clients, always on deals? I guess it's for the slightly more well-versed in the channel. They've seen the value, maybe they've tested, they've delivered. Is it then the next logical iteration, or is there still some uncertainty or unknowns around that? I guess, is it becoming more important to your customer base?
Well, we tend to use the always on for other digital channels and out of home just because of what it does as a channel and how we would use it programmatically to drive, event-based campaigns or location-based campaigns is always going to be brief-led. So that doesn't really work with always-on deals. And we're kind of doing the education piece around that to say, what is it that you want this programmatic digital out-of-home campaign to deliver? We kind of need to plan for that on a case-by-case basis. I guess, with certain advertisers and with certain events, we could end up having an always-on deal that kind of delivers that buffet, if you like. But otherwise, no, out of home, not quite yet.
Okay, thank you. Last couple of questions now before we open up to the room. I quite like to sort of look ahead and look kind of at what almost, not necessarily predictions, but what do we know needs to be true? Almost if we were sat here in a year's time, what would we be frustrated with if it wasn't solved or it hadn't progressed? So I guess maybe to all of you, what sort of 3 things do we already know we have to solve and maybe we're not doing enough of? We've touched on a few topics. I don't mind who wants to go first. I don't know, Helen, maybe if we start at that end.
Yeah, so certainly measurement, and how do we get the measurement piece right across the different channels so that we make it easier? I think consolidation as well. I think, out of home has always been quite a fragmented channel. And I think there's a danger with programmatic digital out of home that we're actually duplicating that fragmentation. So one of the things that we would like to see more of is consolidation, both across platforms, but also in terms of how we work together, programmatic and out of home specialists, so that we can drive that growth. And I think that's it, actually.
Those are
the two key things that I think we need to be focusing on.
Okay, yeah, I think fragmentation is a really interesting point.
And education, continued education piece.
Yeah, thank you. Alvaro?
Yeah, first of all, I would say education, big point. In HP, a lot of the team, for example, were more digital. So I'm actually very grateful for my out-of-home partners back in Peru that taught me the basics of out-of-home, because it's an important point to that, because a lot of the skill sets don't match sometimes now with programmatic. From my side, I think, speaking of measurement, I think we focus too much on measurement, but sometimes we let go of the planning method. I think out of home, from the beginning, it's a very, how do you plan it? How much do you know, especially compared to other digital channels, you know how much you put and you get clicks, or you get views, or you get foot, whatever. But out of home is how much do I really need to put in so I know what I'm gonna receive? And I think while we're improving so much in measurement, planning is still a bit in the early stages, and something that we could you see it with other emerging channels, like connected TV as well. Compared to TV that you can plan for everything, connected TV is also in a very early stage. And I think out of home, I would like to see it improve in that point. And then the other point that I would like to add that makes me excited as an advertiser, but worried as a audience member, is that we don't really know yet what other touch points are going to become out-of-home touch points. In our daily lives, more screens are becoming part of where we are. It used to be a time where having a digital out-of-home ad in your cab would be something strange. And now it's a mainstay, it's one of the digital out-of-home touch points. So I think we don't even know what else is going to become a digital out-of-home touch point and a screen to impact people at this point. Where? I don't even know. So that's it.
Thank you. Chanel?
It's right if I have 4.
Well, Helen only had 2,
okay,
so that's fine.
I'll use up Helen's.
You can borrow one of hers. Yeah.
Okay, so data and measurement, I think, is absolutely paramount. We've talked a lot about data and measurement already, and I think that we're going to see more and more businesses entering this space. And as a platform ourselves, we are exploring more and more data and measurement opportunities, because we know that that's what fuels confidence in out of home and all of the channels that we operate. So that's one thing that I think will definitely continue for the years to come. Creative, there's going to be more and more creative opportunities that are afforded by the digitalization of screens. There's going to be lots of different types of creatives as well. Some of the out of home screens that are now being put into the ecosystem are super, super interesting. The rise of AI, the rise of experiential experiences, what do they look like? So I think creative is also one to watch. We talked about sustainability. We all know we need to be doing more in that space. And I think that as advertisers, as agencies demand more of the partners that they work with, there's going to be a huge shift in what platforms like ours, media owners, et cetera, need to be doing in this space to keep up. Because ultimately, if advertisers start controlling where budgets go based on that, then that's ultimately going to make the rest of the industry move quicker. And I said I was going to have 4, but I've actually forgotten what the 4th one is. I think
it will come back to you.
it will come back to me. It will come back. Oh, sorry, no, the most important one, sorry. Omnichannel. The fact that there's going to be more and more absorbance of out of home into that omnichannel ecosystem. The fact that when we see briefs now, we rarely get one channel briefs anymore. It's usually 2, 3, 4 channels that are working together. I say that of the briefs that we now receive, probably 20 to 30% are, I want to run on this one channel. Most of them are audience first, and that's a huge shift that we've seen over the last couple of years, moving from this is the channel, I want to reach this audience, to this is the audience, where should I be activating this? Because as consumers, we don't consume in silo, so why are we planning and buying in silo? And I think that agencies are shifting the model and shifting the way that they buy, and have shifted very, very quickly. And I think that that's going to be a huge thing that is a mainstay that continues next year.
I think that 70-80% wanting to look at audience is a really critical statistic, because I do agree there's a lot of education needed, but everyone in this room is educating all of the time, whomever they're talking to. And rightly or wrongfully, that will continue. It has to continue. But I think the fact that data points suggest that people are now looking at, they understand the channel, where it sits alongside, in the main, not fully, is fantastic. I'm really glad you mentioned creative, because my observation is, brands there is brilliant creative that is not being utilised omni-channel, and it's actually, that is an easy sort of barrier to break down. Again, back to the consumer behind, the consumer is the recipient of the advert. They're the person being influenced, and actually that creative cross-channel just really takes them on a lovely journey. And I think there's a lot more that can be done around that, definitely. So, last question, and obviously we're here talking about outdoor. Digital outdoor, programmatic, maybe the programmatic word will go over time. It is just outdoor as part of a kind of omni-channel. But where does everything we've talked about today sit within your business priorities? So Chanel, I'll start this end first this time.
Definitely.
How critical is this channel as part of Hawk's ambition going forward?
Yeah, huge. We don't place certain importance on one channel over another. I think that all of the channels that we operate are super, super important. Agencies and brands use us in very, very different ways. So it is very important. But the fact that we can lift all of those channels is also super important to our business. So the fact that we are seeing out of home taking more and more share every year means that we do have a focus on it and where we can find solutions to try and push what we're doing forward. But yeah, it's of paramount importance to us. It's only going to increase in revenue, and as a business, obviously, we want to be at the forefront of that, and I think that we are at the forefront of that as well. So yeah, huge importance.
Exciting times. Thank you ever so much. Alvaro?
Yeah, like I mentioned, since last year, we've been the graph is going up in terms of like the importance of the programmatic data of home in our business. Not only for the big countries, but also for emerging markets as well. Like we're starting a new planning cycle soon, and data of home is part of it. We are seeing the strategic points to use it. And the way I see it, for example, is like, programmatic, we usually call traders, right? Like stocks. Sometimes you see stocks that are undervalued, and data of home we're seeing it as a channel that after COVID has been neglected for a while. So I think the earliest we thought to jump into it, to build that relationship, to have the mainstay, and to know how to properly work it into our business, the better. So that's why we're just, keep it going.
Great to hear. Thank you, Helen. Maybe final thoughts from you.
Well, it's growing, so it's an area of focus for us. With my kind of out of home hat on, it's fantastic to be able to see programmatic driving growth in out of home. But we're working really closely as well with our programmatic teams to look at how we can make sure that we're working together to get better planning outcomes for our clients. And we've partnered with tech platforms to make sure that we're moving forward in this space really quickly.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Obviously, there's some questions on Slido, which I'll try and work through. I think we've got a bit of time. So I'll try and work out who's best to answer these. Thank you for everyone that's posted questions on Slido. In no particular order, let's start pretty near the top. So one from Dom. Thank you, Dom. It's unlike you to ask a question, isn't it? So, bridging the offline to online gap is something we're asked for, but brands often won't allow a pixel to be dropped on their sites. Any advice? Should we ask a brand that?
Oof, yes. It is a touchy subject. We always get the requests from the publishers to, hey, can we put a pixel here to improve it? I think it's important to have a good tech partner to hold everything together. I think because from our side, even speaking in a sustainability standpoint, having a ton of pixels in your website is just going to make it worse as in terms of user experience. So having a good tech partner that will allow us to have a pixel in, and then that we can put that data and optimize ourselves, because we're also trying to do omni-channel. I think that's the point. And like I was saying as well, we think the universe of measurable devices for digital out of home, depending on the country, and basically most countries, is still not representative enough that I think a pixel will make a difference.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I really like this next question. I don't know who posted it, but thank you. Have you seen any brands, so this is probably a Chanel and Helen question perhaps, have you seen any brands that have a coherent strategy that elaborates the role of out-of-home, so direct and digital and programmatic, within the omni-channel environment? So basically brand examples where that kind of real omni strategy is really prevalent is the question. So I don't know if you have any examples you could share. Or...
And I'll leave that one to you.
Yes, yeah. A lot of the brands that we're working with at the moment, you know where they want out of home to sit, and almost it's being used as the conversation starter with audiences of how you go from one to many to one to one. So a lot of brands will say, look, I'm going to activate this campaign, or we want to activate this campaign based on your planning data in these specific areas, but then to reach these specific audiences, but then we want to retarget with other channels off the back of it. Again, I'll come back to it. The Gusto example back in 2020 is a really, really good one. We ran a brand uplift study off the back of that, and we found that every single metric was increased from awareness right down to purchase intent once when that user had been exposed to out of home first. So when that out of home was used as that conversation starter and then retargeted, we found that the metrics and the awareness and the purchase intent and everything was increased off the back of it. So I think there are lots of brands that are doing it well, but out of home is largely seen as the conversation starter rather than the retargeting piece, because that would be nigh on impossible to do. Just to quickly come back to the first question, if I may, for Dom, I think, sorry, shameless plug, but some of the work that we're doing in this space for search is really good, because that's aggregated search, and it's not to do with a pixel on a site. It's not to look at a user then going onto a site and looking at what that specific person did, but it's looking at aggregated search and what's going on off the back of that out-of-home campaign. And number one, that's super privacy compliant, doesn't require any pixels on site, and gives you really, really nice output as well. So if there's any brands or agencies that want to know more about that, then let me know. Well, you kind of teed me up for it, mate. So I couldn't not.
Shameless plugs are allowed. It's fine. Yeah. Helen, any shameless plugging from your side?
No. I think the only shameless plug is I'm running a half marathon on Sunday. So if you want to sponsor me, you can go to my LinkedIn page and sponsor me.
We'll put it on screen. So that's a great plug. I really like this question as well. It says, with digital out of home, over 60% of UK out of home spend. So just to repeat that, DOOH is 60% of UK out of home spend now. By the end of the decade, what percentage share of total digital out of home will the programmatic element be? Now there's a lot of elements to that. But my take, it depends what you read. Globally, the outdoor market depends what you read, about 45 billion, of which the digital element is about 21 billion. I always look at CTV, which is about 3 times bigger, just for anyone that wants a reference point. Programmatic of the digital part is still pretty small. I think we all know that, although growing. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on what percentage the programmatic element will be going forward. The question is end of decade, but obviously that's very specific. So does anyone have any thoughts on almost the market share of ad spend that we can command, I guess? So.
Well, for us, digital out of home, the programmatic split is basically 100%. We, at this point, most screens that are, relevant to us can be bought programmatically, and it's just much easier. And you have it with all your media. So we don't really buy any digital out of home outside the programmatic buying. So while I don't want to make any predictions on the end of the decade, I think, HP is I would like to see it get to that sort of percentage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else?
I would just say, automation isn't going to slow down. So therefore, I would expect programmatic share to increase. And I know that agencies are doing more and more to automate the buying across all of their different channels. They're seeing the benefits of it. Until they don't see the benefits, it's only going to accelerate.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think eventually we would expect that all out-of-home is an automated buy. So while it might not be bought programmatically, you should be able to have a blend of programmatic digital out-of-home and automated traditional out-of-home, which will drive kind of that number up, I guess. But ideally, we'd want to be able to buy everything through one platform eventually, so that we can measure across analog and digital.
Yeah, and that's where probably addressable becomes a better term than programmatic,
Yeah.
right? And ultimately, that's what we're all moving to.
My personal opinion, I'll go back to the stat I mentioned earlier. I worked in display 2010 onwards, and the programmatic proportion then of display was pretty limited. 13 years later, it's about 95%. That doesn't mean this channel will become 95%, but it is an interesting statistic that says it's taken 13 years to get to that point. But I think this channel will accelerate much quicker, because the expectation is now around audiences and data, and there are learnings, natural learnings from how every other channel has developed and iterated. I don't know what statistic we'll be at by the end of the decade, but I think we'll accelerate quite quickly, is my opinion. So I think we've got time for one or two more questions. There's loads of great questions on here. I want to tackle this one about creative, because we just started to touch on it. Really lovely question again. Are we doing enough to ensure the creative going onto public screens via programmatic is suitable? I've seen some poor examples that look like online creative. Really great point. If we're going to give this channel the real foot up it deserves, then the execution has to be brilliant. Anyone want to tackle a creative-led question and getting it right?
Yeah, I think it exhibits similar traits to what we found when we first entered the mobile space. And I think you can kind of draw parallels between those two scenarios. When we first launched back in 2015 in the UK, we were getting a lot of truncated desktop ads that we were just being asked to run on mobile, without the realization that those two screens are completely different. One is landscape, one is portrait. So that's why we built the studio in the business, and that's why the studio do so much great repurposing of ads to make them suitable for the screen. So similarly, now you're probably seeing programmatic teams or pure play programmatic players that are saying, right, I've got these ads, these mobile ads, these desktop ads, and I want to run them on out of home. And that's where repurposing those ads becomes really, really important. I think it's been a learning curve for us as we've entered into the programmatic out-of-home space. Unlike other channels, there's little standardization between creatives across different SSPs, and that's not anyone's fault. But it's just different to the way that we executed mobile-driven campaigns, where a 320 by 50 was a 320 by 50. So I think that creative is moving forwards. I think people just need to appreciate that, as Alvaro mentioned earlier, we are consumers, we consume with our eyes. We don't look at data strategies, we don't look at measurement, and therefore you need to put creative really in the mix with data, alongside data and measurement when we're planning a campaign. And that's where working with expert studios or creative agencies or whoever you might work with for creative is as important as the delivery of those ads themselves.
We've got a few more questions, so I might just try and go to one person just to get through two or three more, and then I think we'll be at time. Helen, maybe for yourself, because it's a sort of a real case, how big is the advantage for a brand or agency who started programmatic a few years ago versus those getting going today?
I think that's a tricky question. I think I think that sometimes there's a danger that with an out-of-home legacy, you think with an out-of-home hat on. So I think it's mixed. I think if you've got a startup agency now, they don't have that legacy. But equally, as Alvaro was saying earlier, and I'd be interested to get his point on this as well, what was it that he learnt from his colleagues in Peru about out-of-home that has really impacted what he's doing from a programmatic digital out-of-home perspective? Because, what we're finding, going back to this whole education piece, is how do you make sure that, yes, you can buy digital out-of-home programmatically, but you do need to understand the nuances of out-of-home, the location, the time of day, the mindset, and going back to creative as well. How do you bring all of that together to really, really use out-of-home as it should be used, and leverage on all of that? So I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to that question, actually.
Yeah, I personally don't think there is. I think there's learnings. There's also, as you say, there's learnings that will be useful or may cloud. I don't know. So Alvaro, just from a brand perspective, a short answer maybe, anything?
Yeah, just going to what Helen was saying. I think some things that I learned was like, look at it from like, it's just about a logic. Like sometimes with digital, you just pull the ad out and then you know the placement and that's it. But with out of home, it's like a physical space. You need to know how the location is. And for example, for us, since we're planning sometimes campaigns in countries we've never been in, we do need to check, hey, this is in the middle of a parking lot that no one's gonna watch. Why are we buying the screen? Just because the audience is there, you know? So you need to have just like sometimes take the digital hat on and put on like, hey, this is an ad that's gonna be here. Is it watchable? Is it like on the road? What type of product is it? Like for example, one of the campaigns we run is sometimes we have an ink delivery service that's more complex. You need more frequency, smaller elements. Sometimes we just do a piece of hardware that is very simple to advertise and to show, so that can be used in larger elements. You know, you need to see, it's logic sometimes and instinct, and it's something that you need to develop over time, but it's something that in digital, sometimes you don't think about it because it's just like push the button, you get the clicks, and then maybe you optimize. But in here, it's harder than that.
Yeah, because, just to jump in again, I think also, you know, it's this one-to-one versus one-to-many.
Exactly.
So, for example, Piccadilly Circus or Times Square is going to be a completely different use of a screen than if you're, you know, going down an escalator and there are lots of different digital panels and you're wanting to drive frequency or sequencing of messaging. And so that needs to be understood.
Yep, agreed. Thank you. Two last questions. One I'll tackle. It's actually which DSPs are most set up for programmatic so far.
Shameless plug.
I can't have you answer that one. That would be a plug. Joking aside, I think the pragmatic answer is when I joined Vue 4 years ago, I think there were about a dozen DSPs connected to the platform. There's now 40. And those 40, in some cases, are global. Some cases, they're singular market. Some are singular channel, and some are omnichannel. So there's a whole myriad of answers to that. I think all I'd say is you've seen a lot of the omnichannels, and you know, Hawk included, of course, invest a lot in the out-of-home planner of their business. And that's indicative that they feel that the industry has legs, has a future, and is something their upstream buyers expect and demand. Okay, so rather than give other names, there are, I would say, the majority of DSPs now have an omnichannel element. Some it's in more of a beta, the majority it's much more advanced and has been for a few years. But hopefully some of the examples Chanel's given you is kind of, I guess, you know, testifies to that. So there's some great businesses out there, though. So by all means, do some research or come and speak to Vue. The team are here at the end if you want to. All right.
Without saying any names, I would like to also add, like, in terms of out-of-home, it's important, like, your DSP, I think, especially in emerging channels, they're, like, need to be, like, your partner. You need someone with a lot of tech power. You need someone with a lot of experience because, at least for when you're a big brand, you need someone that knows what they're doing as well. Sometimes you have some DSPs that just, the support might not be there, or the know-how might not be there, or maybe they're a big DSP that just started doing out-of-home like this year or whatever, and it's like, maybe you don't work with those type of platforms because you need someone that can fill the gaps, going back to the education, especially when you have programmatic teams in some cases that are not out-of-home burst. You need someone that is already troubleshooted a lot of the problems and has the ability to do like the stuff you need.
Thank you. Last question, and I'm picking on this one because there's loads more. So we'll try and get, if you've asked something and it hasn't been answered, please do come and speak to the panel at the end. But last one, because it probably is a narrative from all of us. How do you see the future of inventory verification? How can media owners, SSPs, DSPs support brands to prove the quality of the screens they support? I think it's a great question. Quality is paramount, of course, for future investment. So possibly 30 seconds from everyone if you've got an opinion. How do we all essentially ensure the future of inventory quality and verification? Any thoughts?
I think, you know, one of the benefits of out-of-home, digital out-of-home, is you can see it. So, you know whether a campaign is played because you can actually physically see it on the screen. I think, it's incumbent upon out-of-home publishers, if you want to call them that, to make sure that the quality of their screens are good, a good location, well maintained, etc. And I know that the SSP partners that they work with put them through quite a stringent assessment process to make sure that that is the case. So, I think it's incumbent upon all of us.
Yep, agreed. Chanel?
Yep, totally agree with what Helen said there. I mean, you can go and see the ads, and I think that's something that's maybe a little bit different to some of the other channels that we've worked in previously. I think that there's more curated supply and more curated media owners than the desktop and mobile space. So therefore, it's not so much of like a long tail. So I think that inherently there is that trust there with out of home between all of us and also with consumers as well. I would also say that it's probably the only channel that we work across that doesn't have independent verification at the moment. There's no third-party tracking. Not to say that that's been problematic in any way, but if as you mentioned earlier, Gavin, if you want out of home to be part of that conversation and not to be on the side, then it needs to exhibit the same traits. So perhaps independent verification is what that looks like. But I know that every media owner, every SSP is working on their own solution for that. So that is absolutely happening at the moment. But that's just one observation from our standpoint.
Absolutely. Alvaro, anything to add?
Yes, I think from my standpoint, coming from Latin America where there are no standards of quality, like you could tell your partner, hey, I want a screen right here, can you do it on top of my house? Yeah, sure. And coming to Europe, that you guys have a lot of regulations because this is in the street, so you have a lot of regulations in place, and since it's a legacy channel, I think a lot of standards have already been put in place, and it's important as well for like the city because it's about placement and zoning. So I think that's where it comes in. So I'm not as worried about the standards of quality, at least in some part, at least in Europe, for example. Some other parts of the world, we do need to see where it is exactly placed. But I think that some of the job has already been done because they're coming, like out of home has been from the beginning. So a lot of the legwork has been done compared to digital that was just like a Wild West, and then you had to figure out brand safety and everything,
Yep. Yeah, thank you. My take very briefly, quality inventory, quality audience metrics behind that will ultimately be the initial barometer. And then I think the role the SSP plays in terms of adding the technology to verify what is being played is the first step potentially of a future journey with other verifiers. But right now, we have to make sure that we're clear on what's being played and obviously when and how. So. Thank you to the panel. Maybe a round of applause to the panel, please.